Kia ora, katoa, and welcome to the Hate Crime and Racism and Why We Should Expect a Spike During a Crisis. I hope you and your whānau are all safe and well at this globally challenging time. Ena rangatera katoa, tēnā koutou, ko Earle aho, no UK aho. My name is Earle Wilkes, and I have the privilege of chairing today's fireside conversation. Before we get started, just some basic housekeeping. Professor Spoonley, who I'll introduce in a little while, will speak for around 25 minutes, and there will be around 20 minutes for questions. Rochelle, who's our moderator, will be collecting questions. So if you look at your Zoom control panels at the bottom of the screen, you should see the chat icon and you'll be able to post your questions there. As I mentioned earlier, this is the webinar for the Hate Crime and Racism and Why We Should Expect a Spike During a Crisis, which is rather apt at the moment. And with me today is Professor Paul Spoonley, who will be leading our discussions. Paul is one of the leading thinkers on racism and its impact on society in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and internationally. Paul is a professor of sociology in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Massey University. He was until recently the college's pro-vice chancellor, and he's just finished a book on changing demography of New Zealand and is writing up his research on New Zealand's far right for another book. And is also working with the Max Planck Institute of Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany to provide various forms of visualization on Auckland and Sydney's super diversity. Professor Spoonley was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand in 2011 and was granted the title of Distinguished Professor of Massey University in 2013. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Spoonley.
Kia ora, ngā mihi kia koe Earle, kia ora tata katoa, ngā mihi nui, e ngā mana na waka na reo, o ngā mana whenua, ngā tangata whenua, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou hui nei, e hoa mā, kia ora mānau, tēnā koutou, kia ora tata katoa. These are very strange times, and some of you will have heard the news today that the Christchurch shooter, whose name I do not pronounce, has pleaded guilty to the 51 charges of murder. And it's really that event last year which began to crystallize for me the reasons why we should be having a discussion about hate speech. And for me, hate speech has the ability to compromise, to inhibit a Te Tiriti-based future. And it's one of the challenges we face in having an authentic and mana-enhancing conversation about this country and its future. It's problematic. It might not be the most important factor. It's one of many. And it's one that I want to talk about in terms of my own experiences today and to invite you to participate in a discussion, a community discussion about what it means. I think it's changed quite significantly, and I want to talk about these reasons for its change. I think it's been changed in terms of the rise of a nationalist, populist, anti-immigrant, anti-diversity set of politicians and parties around the world. I think it's changed because of the internet. And it's really changed in terms of the targets of hate. So hate speech, I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a moment, but hate speech has been around for a long time, but we've added to the targets and we've begun to target other groups. In 2017, I was asked to chair a group that were looking at hate speech, which involved the Human Rights Commission, UNESCO, one or two other agencies. And I produced a brief report or a background report for that group as we began to explore what hate speech was. The paper that I wrote is called Te Whakamau Hahara ki te Uparangi, Hate Speech in the Age of the Internet. And I'm very happy to to make that available to anybody who wants to see it. And I want to thank Mehana Jury for that title. And my argument is a simple one, really, and that is that in the digital age, the opportunities, the potentialities for hate speech have increased enormously, and it's compounded by the anxieties that many people feel around the world. And it's that association between the possibilities of the technology or the digital age and the anxieties that are being felt, which is combining to produce this new era, this new phase of hate speech. And if you look at the evidence from various agencies, it might be Hidayah in the Middle East looking at Muslim extremism, it might be the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Centre, then all of them are recording a significant increase in hate speech since about 2015 and 16. Year on year, the amount of hate speech has increased very significantly around the world, including New Zealand. And I ask you, if you're interested in this and interested in the spike, to look at the Southern Poverty Law Centre, and they've got a hate map or a hate watch there, and it's very illuminating. It's also rather depressing. As the 15th of March showed in 2019, we are not exempt from any of this. And I learned a very valuable lesson when I was at the University of California, Berkeley in 2010. I rocked up to do a book with Richard Bedford on migration to New Zealand and diversity. And I was happily writing away, but around me was the Tea Party really getting established. And I thought, well, this is quite an interesting phenomenon. I don't know very much about it, so let me go along and learn. And so I went to a number of Tea Party meetings, and I took much more notice of them. And late in that year, we had a seminar at UC Berkeley in which these politics, these emerging politics were going to be discussed. Most of the people in the room felt that the Tea Party was an aberration, it was a marginal group, it lacked good information. If it had more information, the people who were supporting the Tea Party would alter their views. But there was a speaker later in the day called Ali Hochschild, and many of you might know her. She wrote a very good book in 2016 called Strangers in Their Own Land, and she too was looking at the Tea Party. By the way, the subtitle is called Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And what she discovered in the various interviews she did through the United States in those years, and she was just in the research phase when she talked about in 2010, was that there were people who were beginning to see women, ethnic minorities, gay and lesbians, immigrants, as cutting into the line, as she called it, that their lives were being turned around by what was happening in the American economy, and particularly the loss and the departure of employment and careers. So the Fordist economy, the car manufacturers in the United States were disappearing. The gig economy was very precarious. People couldn't rely upon their jobs. There was an offshoring of many of the jobs, movement of jobs to other parts of the world. And there was a lack of trust in the core institutions of the United States. And what Harley said at that meeting was, do not dismiss the Tea Party as an aberration, as something that will go away or that you can educate away. It was something that was going to develop into much more of a movement because of the way in which people were feeling anxious under a period of significant social and economic change in the United States. And of course, she was right. And as those anxieties began to spike, then the Tea Party moved into the center of the American political establishment, particularly the Republican Party. And of course, we had Trump elected. My view is that we've got various things coming together. The possibilities of the internet, these populist anti-diversity politicians and politics, and the anxieties around jobs. So whenever we get a period in which people are anxious, they want to look for evidence of why something is occurring to them, but they're also looking for explanations. And of course, at the moment, many people around the world want to blame ethnic and religious minorities. So let me come to hate speech, and let's talk a little bit about what I mean by this. It's a relatively recent term. It was coined in 1989 by Mare Matsuda, and it referred to, at the time, insulting or offensive speech. I would adopt the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its definition. So what it defines as hate speech reflects three different factors. One is the conduct of a speaker, that somebody is advocating hatred. The second is the intent of the speaker. Is that person trying to incite hatred or trying to incite violence? And the third is there an audience that is actually in fact being incited? So those three components are what you'll find in most definitions of hate speech. Facebook, interestingly enough, has quite a good definition of hate speech as part of its policies. And it says anything that directly attacks people based on protected characteristics. Those protected characteristics, and remember this is Facebook, are race, ethnicity, and national origin, religious affiliation, sex or gender identity, disability or disease. And those tend to be the protected characteristics that you'll find in many parts of the world as governments and agencies try to respond to this increase in hate speech. So that's my definition, and I'll come back to the New Zealand circumstances in a moment. But the other aspect is the possibilities of the internet in communicating your hate. So in my words, there is a new world of hate around the world. And it's got various components. One is that it is increasingly international. And so one of the problems we have is that it is cross-jurisdictional, that what happens in the United States or the UK or Germany also appears in New Zealand. And I would point out that some of the things that have occurred in New Zealand also appear around the world. The shooter in Christchurch has been, and I use the word with quotation marks around it, an inspiration to other shooters, El Paso, Hanau. And the other point that I would want to make, which relates to the book that Earle mentioned on, that I'm writing on the far right, and that is that we have groups like right-wing resistance, which were developed in Christchurch, but then appeared around the world, Sweden, the UK, the USA, Germany. And so we've exported, in this case, a white supremacist group around the world. The point I want to make about that is that when you look at right-wing resistance in New Zealand, it has quite a sophisticated online presence, or had. It's tended to decline. So what the internet has done is make available the technology that allows you to communicate one-to-one, but also one-to-many, your hate and your reasons for your hate. And so that's why you see this replication around the world of these manifestos and these same sort of arguments. So the Camus book in 2011, 2012, which talked about reverse colonization, the Great Replacement, is now very common because of the opportunity to spread it around the internet. It remains available for a long time, and one of the challenges we have is that many of the major platforms are beginning to realize that they have a responsibility and are beginning to respond to this hate by taking down, monitoring, and then taking down hate as they encounter it. And they've added to the algorithms by also having content managers so that they begin to manage that. But of course, there are many other platforms, many of them in the dark web, that mean that what happens, even in the mainstream platforms, very rapidly migrates and stays there. So it's not as though by taking it down on Facebook, you're then ending its life. Not at all. And by the way, I would point out that Facebook, since that began to take a more active interest has taken down 2.8 million posts, inappropriate posts relating to the Christchurch killing. There's the question of anonymity, that people can stay anonymous on the web and say what they like without repercussions. So that's making it much more difficult. And so what I want to argue is that, yes, a crisis will prompt anxieties and prompt people to think about reasons why they do not like, why they want to attack, why they want to denigrate other people. But the internet has been the mechanism that's allowed that to happen. So when we come to the internet, then we need to understand that we can moderate hate speech on the internet, but we've got some very important political questions to ask. One of those questions is around the severity test. What constitutes hate speech and therefore breaches the public code that we would agree to and which would regard certain types of speech as inappropriate? Peter Tatchell, who some of you might remember was an activist, and he wrote in 2007 a very influential paper, which I rate, but he asked questions like, who decides? Is causing offence inevitably an incitement? Where is the line between robust criticism and satire and incitement to hatred? And of course, he's raised there the question of satire and humour, and that is very, very difficult. But one of the things we've got to agree is that if hate speech is something that we want to minimise and which we want to control, then we've got to establish a severity test. Do we have a severity test in New Zealand? And the related question is, how significant is hate speech in Aotearoa? Let me come to that second one first. The simple answer is we don't know. Because while we've got agencies like NetSafe, Human Rights Commission, action stations looking at hate speech in New Zealand, either they are doing surveys of a limited sample, or they're taking people who self-respond, or they're looking at complaints. So they are a very selective view of what's actually happening. When we were doing the work on hate speech in 2017, we brought together a range of community groups who talked to us about their experiences online. And it was a very sobering day. And one of the things that hadn't really occurred to me, but which I now understand, particularly from the research that's been done by NetSafe and action stations, is that there are particular groups that are being targeted very specifically and on whom hate speech is having an impact. Some of those are ethnic and religious minorities. It includes Māori, but it also includes young New Zealanders. And that impact on young New Zealanders and what it did in terms of self-confidence, identity, and then led on to self-harming and possibly other forms of harm was quite profound and very moving, I must say. So we don't know exactly how much hate speech there is because we really don't have an agency which collects all the data and which monitors what's happening and then tells us, because we're still inching towards that sort of conclusion. We do know quite a bit about hate speech because those who are targeted will tell us if we're listening. And one of the problems I have is that when I talk about hate speech, very often there are people in the community who would prefer to emphasise free speech because to them, the nature of hate speech and what it might do to a particular individual or group is invisible. They've never been the target. And we've got to get beyond that. We've got to have an open discussion. So we don't collect data systematically and we don't tell people about it. The second thing is, in terms of hate speech in this country, the problem is that our existing provisions are ambiguous or incomplete. So Section 61 of the Human Rights Act, I think, provides us with a workable definition. But of course, it's incomplete. It needs to be expanded to include things like homophobia in Islamophobia. At the moment, it doesn't. We have the Harmful Digital Communications Act, which is quite good, but again, it tends to be complaints-based. And even with the provisions that we have, there's a reluctance to act upon them, or it's very difficult to establish that the threshold has been breached. So, for example, in terms of the Section 61 of the Human Rights Act and its predecessor, the last prosecution, successful prosecution, was in 1977 against the National Socialist White People's Party for anti-Semitic pamphlets. And you might remember Louisa Ward brought a case against a newspaper and a particular cartoon. The court ruled that there was incitement, but the threshold in terms of establishing that other people were incited was not established. And my concern at that was that it was the complainant who needed to establish that the threshold had been breached. I think this brings us to a broader conversation, and I mentioned at the beginning about mana enhancing. We have some very difficult issues to address around rights, diversity rights, the rights of tangata whenua, and how we're going to move this country to a tiriti-based future. We're on a journey, and it's a very difficult journey because we really need to address the anxieties that people might have and the tendency to blame others, and therefore for that to escalate into hate speech. Can I suggest a couple of UK books that I found quite inspirational? One of these is by Nazreen Malik. It's called We Need Stories, Challenging the Toxic Myths Behind Our Age of Discontent. One of those myths is the myth that there's a free speech crisis. What Nazreen argues is that there is more speech, and that, of course, is a function of the internet, that more of it is hateful, and that what she thinks is actually happening is that some are arguing that the freedom to speak, and particularly to speak hateful things, is being sought without any sort of censure or reaction. And I want to read a sentence from her. A moral right to express unpopular opinions is not a moral right to express those opinions in a way that silences the voices of others or puts them in danger of violence. And the other book is Rennie Eldo Lodge, who's written a very interesting book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And what she argues is that there has been a defense of bigotry, that bigots are given moral equivalence in many circumstances, because what you have is you want what she calls performing rage. You want people to be enraged in front of a camera because that gets you an audience. And so this polarization of public debate and the willingness to give moral equivalence or political equivalence to people who are bigoted with those who are arguing for diversity and for recognition and respect. And finally, I want to quote Jeremy Waldron, who's a New Zealander, who's probably the most prominent moral legal philosopher in the world, in which he argues that hate speech damages the dignity and reputation of individuals in vulnerable groups. So let me begin to wrap up here. My concern is that as we deal with these very difficult times, I wrote the title for this presentation before I knew exactly what was happening with COVID-19. But COVID-19 is exactly the sort of moment where people feel anxious and therefore want to blame others, or some want to blame others. And I did a little search earlier today to look at COVID-19 and Muslims. Some really interesting but also very disturbing items come up in there about people arguing about the role of Muslims in terms of COVID-19. Very inappropriate, not fact-based. So my concern is that until we get to a point where we have agreement about what is hate speech then we're going to allow discussion and content and contributions to public debate which are going to undermine social cohesion and what I would call social peace, because they attack individuals and groups in ways that are inappropriate and in ways that are hateful, and that we need to have a discussion about what hate speech might constitute, but we also need to agree about what we're going to do about it. And I rather like Karl Popper, who wrote this while he was in New Zealand, by the way. If we extend unlimited tolerance to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. But what would I like to see happen? Well, firstly, I would like us to have a debate, a discussion about what constitutes hate speech, and to be clear about its unacceptability in these difficult times, and to talk about those thresholds, to talk about what we have available to us in terms of responding to it. The second, I think, is to express solidarity and offer support to those who are targeted. As I said before, I think the difficulty is that for those of us who are not targeted, then the full impact of hate speech is largely invisible and not understood by us. So let's understand that by talking to those who are targeted. Let's discredit in whatever way we can those claims and comments which are hurtful, inaccurate, and hateful. And I think we can do that, but I think it requires all of us to participate in that. We need to encourage media and online literacy, because in an age in which there is too much information, where there is inappropriate and hurtful information, then we need people who are much more digitally literate. Our digital citizenship is actually fundamentally important for all of us. And let's ensure that there's adequate monitoring and appropriate monitoring of what is happening in terms of hate in our community. My response is that legislation should not be the first or last port of call. This is a citizenship issue in terms of how we have mana-enhancing debates and discussion about issues of very fundamental importance to this country, particularly as it begins to diversify and recognise Te Tiriti issues and rights. But in this, we can't have, in this case, hate speech destabilising those public discussions. Hate speech is not mana enhancing. It undermines the legitimacy and the rights and the respect that is deserved by all of us. Kia ora tata katoa. Thank you, Earle.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Spoonley. That was, before we go to the questions, I found it very informative and very sobering, some of the positions you outlined, particularly the degree to which the whole situation around kind of hate speech, the internationalization and the interconnectedness of this whole area, and particularly struck into when you were talking about actually we're actually not in a position to be able to quantify the size of the issue and the challenge necessarily because of the lack of data and evidence around that, and I suppose the challenge that you're reflecting back to some extent in terms of if legislation is not the first port of call, as it were, how civic society then engineers a situation whereby the discussion that you're talking about is one that's going to be a safe space, particularly for those that are normally at the sharp end of these kinds of conversations.
The answer to that, Earle, is rather complex. So let me just make a couple of key points. One is that the kawa that you see on a marae, in which you resolve the differences that you have before you leave the marae, is one that I think we need to escalate into more public spaces. And it's taking those protocols and saying, in terms of public discussion, then we need to agree that these are protocols that we all should observe. We don't have those really. I mean, what we do is we leave them, leaving aside the Christchurch call, we leave these to the major online platforms to self-regulate. And it is difficult because, of course, that cross-jurisdictional issue is that while we might have ground rules in New Zealand, those then don't apply to people who are operating internationally online. So it's a very, very difficult issue. And I would point to some groups. Action Stations, I think, are doing a fantastic job, but also Sticks and Stones. Sticks and Stones are a group of year 12 and 13 students in Central Otago who've taken it upon themselves to advise other teenagers, in this case, about the options they have if they encounter bullying, for example, online, or they encounter hate speech online. And they're doing a fantastic job. So I think what we've got to do is encourage individuals, but also organisations, to take more responsibility in terms of making sure that these debates, these discussions, particularly online, are, as I keep repeating, mana enhancing and not disrespectful.
Thank you. Thank you. Question that I've got here is around the changing nature of some of the groups. So it says there are a number of outwardly white supremacist groups that have disbanded and gone underground and then resurfaced in different movements, such as New Conservatives. They're infiltrating and using them to broadcast their views and influence others. And the question is, have you seen evidence of this kind of pattern of?
Yes, unfortunately I have, Earle, or the questioner. What's happening is that we've got a new wave of far-right activists and groups in this country. So I mentioned the National Socialist White People's Party before. We still got those sorts of groups, those sort of classic neo-Nazi groups. But the new wave of groups, Action Zalandi would be a case in point, are much more sophisticated in how they present themselves and also how they use the online facilities available to them. Yeah. And I think we've got to be more aware of these. I mean, the 15th of March was a huge wake-up call for New Zealand on a whole lot of levels. And I just wish it hadn't happened. But one of those is that we are not exempt from having extremists. So, Earle, you've come from the UK, the Defence League, there's a whole lot of groups, Tommy Robinson, there's a whole lot of groups who are very active. And what I hope we now understand as New Zealanders is that we've also got those same groups in New Zealand. And so what we now need to be aware of is what they're becoming in terms of political actors in New Zealand.
Yes, thank you. There was another question in regards to the young and the protected groups, and a question in terms of clarification regarding that.
Sorry, could you just repeat that one, Earle?
So what do we mean by young New Zealanders? Is this a protected group in your view, or do we mean?
I see. What was explained to us was that vulnerable groups, particularly teenagers, sorry, I'll start that again. Teenagers were a particularly vulnerable group because of, still in the process of developing identity, being very influenced and influenceable by what happens online. And so when you start and get, for example, people who might have a different gender identity as a teenager, then they become particularly vulnerable online. And the evidence that was presented to us was that this is a real issue for New Zealanders in terms of vulnerable groups. And it's one that I hadn't really thought about before. So I would I would think about Māori, anti-Semitism, so attacks on Jews, Islamophobia, attacks on Muslims. So that's part of what I had been looking at. What I hadn't been so conscious of is that we need to take more notice of particularly younger New Zealanders and what they were experiencing.
Thank you. Another question from a teacher, and it was around advice around how they can introduce conversations around freedom of speech, hate speech with young people within an education setting.
I think there's some quite good New Zealand material. I would both NetSafe and Action Stations have material that you might like to use. There is some very good material internationally. Tell Mama, M-A-M-A, is a UK agency which is the reporting agency for hate speech in the UK, and it does some really very good stuff. I mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Group before, and they have a very good website which allows people to understand what hate looks like and what hate speech looks like. The issue for me is that I think we're very naive about free speech. I think New Zealand is quite tolerant and permissive when it comes to speech, and we tend to veer towards the free speech, not in the way that the US does, but tend to veer towards the free speech end of the argument. And so that work that I was doing in 2017 came to an abrupt halt when Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux came to New Zealand, and we got those public demonstrations in favour of free speech. And of course, that again changed dramatically on the 15th of March 2019. So I think we're a little bit naive. I think we tend to assume that somehow we're exempt from some of these international trends, and we really do need to look what other countries are doing. And I think your teacher, the teacher who's emailed a question in, there is some excellent material online, and perhaps I can communicate that after this session.
Thank you. Next question we've got is a challenging one, in that saying actually we're a bit like it's a bit like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and it's not proactive enough. I don't know what your reflections are in response to that question.
No, I agree. I think that, and that's my point about legislation. If we're going to prosecute, let's take the extreme example. If we're going to prosecute people, then we really have not understood the nature of what we need to do much earlier in the process. So those points about digital literacy or digital citizenship, I think, are fundamentally important to our society. And we need to understand that politics can be influenced by what happens online. So we need to understand what happens online. We need to understand, in a broad sense, the political system and how it's influenced, but also in this case, how certain groups are able to peddle hate online.
Thank you. And another question was around how in New Zealand can we reduce the number of bigoted conservatives?
That's a very interesting question. Our own research, I head up a big project on capturing the diversity dividend for New Zealand. I'm one of them anyway. And what we've been looking at is the way in diversity changes the world around us. And it might change everything from our everyday experiences, like, you know, when we go shopping, when we go to school or whatever, right the way through to major discussions around the rights of tangata whenua. So how do I answer that one? I think the two things that make a difference are contact and education. And so if we look at where tolerance is highest in New Zealand, it tends to be in those areas which have most diversity and the opportunity for contact, and where we can educate one another. If there's anything to be taken out of what's happened after the 15th of March, it is that I think all of us who are concerned about these issues know much more about the Muslim community in New Zealand. And so that's an opportunity to exchange understanding and views, and we need to have that, even if we disagree, we need to have that exchange in a respectful way. So the bigoted conservatives, I think they're with us. I think we've got to understand that they are part of our political spectrum.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. The next question was around obviously your comment around that legislation shouldn't be the first port of call or first remedy, as it were. And one of the questions was challenging. Well, if are not going to be through legislation, how then is their behaviour going to be changed and moderated, or at least constrained?
Yeah, and at that point, I would have to challenge all of us to say, what is it we are going to do? Because I think this is a citizenship issue. I think this is one of those areas where a lot of different agencies and organisations could and can play a role. I think universities have a role to play. I think educational institutions, I think some of the secondary schools in New Zealand that I've looked at are doing a fantastic job in terms of understanding what happens within their school community and beginning to both model good behaviour and challenge bad behaviour. I think organisations, particularly large corporates, should have a much more significant role. You know, very often diversity and tangata whenua recognition comes as an obligation that we somehow do on particular occasions. If that's what we're going to do, then we're not going to address the underlying issue, which is that how do each of us in our everyday lives interact with other people who are different to us in some way? And it's beginning to manage those campaigns, manage that understanding in much more diverse settings. So I think legislation should be the last port of call. In the meantime, what is it that we're doing in our workplaces, in our homes, in our communities, that really begins to challenge those who would say hateful things?
Okay, thanks. And just, I mean, this question is quite timely in that, and it's around what are you seeing? Obviously, the focus of your presentation is around what happens in situations where there's crisis, and now is such a situation around what are you seeing in regards to COVID-19?
Earle, we've lost you. So the question is about the crisis, and I think one of the things that I would invite people to consider is that, you know, these are challenging times. I mean, we're entering a digital age. We're entering an age in which a lot of the economic and social certainties are being changed. I'm a baby boomer. I'm very concerned about the welfare of my children, my adult children, the jobs they can get, the housing is unaffordable. You know, there's a lot. They've got student debt. So these are challenging times. There's nothing much I can do about the challenges per se, but what I think we need to do is address the fact that people are inevitably going to have anxieties. So I've been doing quite a bit of work in terms of immigration. Immigration, between 2013 and 2018, this country gained 260,000 new residents via net migration. That's huge. It's never been experienced. It's 3 times higher than the UK experiences per capita. It's almost 50% higher than Australia. There are people who are going to be anxious about the arrival of these new immigrants in their communities. So we need to recognise that. And that's what Ali Hochschild was doing, I think, back when I heard her speak in 2010. These are not anxieties that are going to go away because they are fundamentally going to change people's lives, and we need to recognise that. So how do we address those anxieties in a way that reduces not necessarily the anxiety, but it reduces the willingness to attack others because of their difference? And I think that's a huge question, which the only thing I can really say, Earle, is that I think we need to recognise that those anxieties are part of life in the 2020s, and that we need to address them, not dismiss them.
Yeah, thank you. And just apologies if there's been any sort of loss, breakup on the line. It's probably peak hour now. Everyone's trying to access the internet, so just apologies on that. I mean, you touched on part of this, on the part of this question in your answer, but I just ask it anyway. And it was around the kind of the anxiety, because you mentioned earlier that hate speech and its connection with people's sense of loss and loss of identity, or their perceived sense of loss, and how one can manage that process in terms of reducing that sense of loss of whatever it might be.
Yes. Can I think it's a really important question, and I want to address it in a very specific way, and that is that I'm Pākehā. So, we've had our hegemony for a very long time. It feels very uncomfortable to be challenged in certain ways, and to feel that somehow we are not going to be able to maintain our hegemony. Sorry, perhaps this is a better word, but our hegemony. So how is it that we have a discussion in which we can talk to Pākehā, with Pākehā, about how being Pākehā, what that means in a 21st century New Zealand in which Te Tiriti plays a more fundamental role? I'm an optimist. I would like to think that we can have that discussion by saying these are the things that you can gain. You're not losing anything, you're gaining something. And that might be very Pollyannish, but it's how you frame it. And I think we've got some wonderful people. I mean, Moana Jackson has been one of the speakers in the series. And, having heard Moana on many occasions, I think that he and others are able to discuss very difficult issues in ways that are not undermining, which are affirming, even to Pākehā who need to change and might need to give up some of the things that they feel some of the things they hold very important. So I think one of the key challenges for us in this area is to say, what is going to be the language, who's going to articulate it, and how do we have that discussion in a way that engages Pākehā, doesn't push them out to the boundaries or push them away from the discussion. And I think that's one of the most profound things that we could do in a Tiriti-based future discussion.
Thank you. The next question really touches on a little bit of that in terms of, and it's about Auckland, and Auckland it says is lauded as a diverse city in terms of where citizens and suburbs are anything but diverse. And it's really a question was around an observation in terms of the relationship between tolerance and diversity in a city that trumped as being super diverse, but actually the question is saying that actually that people are living in isolation, but they're cheek by jowl, and that's
I think Auckland's a very divided city in those terms, so socioeconomically and culturally. So I agree with that. Steve Verdovec was the one who coined the word super diverse, and I use it quite frequently. And you mentioned that I'm doing a project on understanding in this case, visualising super diversity in Auckland. I think Steve and I would rather regret the super. It sounds as though it's sort of positive. And what he meant, and what I certainly mean, is that super diversity complicates our lives because we have all of these diverse issues going on: legal status, socioeconomic status, the impacts of inequality, diversity of religion, language, culture, religion, all of that's in a mix. So it's a very complex situation. I still would go back to what I said before, and that tolerance is very much a function of contact and education. And what I would like to see more of is using those institutions where we come together, particularly institutions like schools, to really begin to grapple with some of these difficult issues. I get very frustrated with the media. We're talking for about an hour here. We don't have long-form journalism broadly in this country. I mean, there are one or two exceptions. But if you're listening to the media, then very often these very complex issues are reduced to a matter of sentences, if not minutes. So it's very difficult to have a discussion, a reasoned discussion. I would keep using the word mana-enhancing discussion about these issues. And I think that applies as much to Auckland as it does elsewhere. So we've got this peculiar situation of being incredibly diverse, much more diverse than any other part of New Zealand, and yet at the same time living very parallel lives. Can I just add to that? I've just finished this book, and one of the things that struck me is how unrepresentative our political institutions are. Our political institutions don't represent the diversity of the city. So that's a major concern that I would have.
Thank you for that. And there's two questions I'll kind of put to you together. One is around about creating that a shared vision, and the next question was also around what role should the public education play in terms of combating hate and racism?
Well, I think public education, everything from kohanga reo all the way through to universities, has a critical role. It's one of those institutions where we all have to, well, nearly all of us have to participate, and it's one of the institutions which has an educated and skilled workforce that is able to help manage some of this. So I think the public education system is critical. My problem is that once you move beyond that, then many of our other institutions fail, in my view. Fail the task of having that discussion. What was the first one again?
It was about the shared vision.
Right. Yes. And for me here, I would like, the thing that I struggle with is who leads the discussion on this? Who has responsibility, but who is able to lead a discussion on this? We need leaders, and I think we do have leaders. I'm a judge for the Diversity Awards, and we're just about to begin this year's round. But in the past, I've been absolutely staggered by how community organisations or business organisations or government organisations have people who are dedicated, who are inspired and who are inspiring, and who lead that organisation and its workforce and sometimes its customers on a journey towards diversity recognition, including recognition of tangata whenua and the inclusion of tangata whenua in authentic ways in the organisation, not simply as a little mihi whakatau or a karakia here and there. So it's meaningful engagement. We really got to get more visibility for those people, and we've really got to get public figures playing a more impassioned and impassioning role for that. The example that I would use is in the wake of the 15th of March. I thought our Prime Minister and many of our public figures did an outstanding job in standing with the victims, expressing our common humanity and providing a degree of leadership. But why should we need a disastrous event like the 15th of March for that to happen. I think it needs to be, that vision needs to be very much part of ongoing discussions. And the question for me is who leads those?
Thanks. And we've got just around 4 minutes, Press Spoonley, and there's a question I've got, and also I don't know if you could kind of just wrap things up for us in terms of some sort of key closing remarks. And on one, I mean, the question itself, it will take more than 5 minutes, 4 minutes to answer. It's around Trump.
Okay.
What is your thought on Trump and his use of hate speech for political gain?
Yes, I'm staggered. I'm quoting Anjum Rahman here, but I'm staggered that some of his Twitter feeds breach Twitter's standards. Why should we allow the rich and the powerful to get away with saying things that I've argued today should not be said by anybody? So I think the way in which Trump operates is very, very disconcerting and rather worrying in terms of seeing Trump. And by the way, it's not only Trump, it's Orban, it's Marie Le Pen, it's in Austria, it's in the UK. There are a lot of countries in which we've got major political figures who are doing the very reverse of what I've argued for in terms of answering that vision question. So I take a big sigh, and I don't know what to wish for here, but I'm very clear that it has mandated some of the hate speech. In terms of closing, Earle, I think it's. I just want to thank the people that are still with us and who are listening to this, because this is one of those opportunities, and to thank the organisers for this. This is an opportunity to have a discussion about something which I think is fundamental to all of us, and that is, how do we have these discussions in public spaces that engage people, not disengage them or make them targets of hate? How do we have a respectful discussion in a way that gives us a future which is full of hope and which does not disparage and misinform people? So it's really an invitation, because I don't have a lot of the answers, as you've heard, in terms of responding to the question, but it's an invitation for all of us to participate in the discussion around hate speech and why people are anxious at a particular point and why they then indulge in hate speech, and what we're going to do as a society.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Spoonley. Thank you for your expertise and for taking us through a very informative journey. And as you say, it's hopefully there will be many others listening who are engaged in this work, and it's an ongoing and never-ending work.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that, and also thank you those who are participating for giving us their time at this challenging time. So thank you all. Be safe and take care of each other.